Shut up! After everything I have done for you, you still had the nerve to take what is not yours from this house?
It wasn't me.
The servant stood frozen. No one dared to breathe. At the center of the room, the old gatekeeper trembled, his hands shaking as he tried to speak.
Enough!
Bring me a cane.
Please, Your Grace. I am innocent.
But she did not listen. Her eyes were cold, unmoved. She lifted her hand, ready to strike, and then something impossible happened. A hand caught hers midair. The entire hall gasped. Silence. Heavy. Unbelievable. No one had ever dared to touch the Duchess. Slowly, she turned. Standing before her, a young maid, calm, unshaken. "Your Grace, please don't." Her voice was soft, but what she had just done was dangerous, very dangerous, because in this house, people who spoke up did not last. Yet here she stood, Miss Rosamond Ashcombe, new, powerless, and completely unaware that this one moment would change everything. Because what began as a simple accusation would soon uncover secrets buried for years, expose a truth no one dared speak, and bring her face to face with the most feared woman in the house. So, how did it all begin? Let's go back to the day Rosamond Ashcombe first stepped into Montclair House. But before we continue, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? And if you love powerful stories like this, make sure you subscribe, because this story is only just beginning. Montclair House stood in quiet command over the Surrey countryside, its tall windows catching the pale morning light, its stone walls polished to perfection. From a distance, it looked like a place of grace and order. Inside, it was something else entirely. The air carried a stillness that was not peaceful, but careful. Servants moved along the corridors with lowered eyes, their footsteps soft against the polished floors. No one lingered, no one spoke unless spoken to. Even the ticking of the long case clock in the main hall seemed too loud, echoing through the silence like a warning. Rosamond Ashcombe arrived just after dawn, her small travel bag clutched tightly in her hand. The iron gates had closed behind her with a final sound that made her glance back for a moment longer than necessary. Ahead, the house rose larger than she had imagined, its doors already open, waiting. Inside, the scent of beeswax and fresh linen filled the air. Everything was clean, everything was in place, and yet something felt wrong. It was not something she could name, only something she felt, like a quiet pressure resting on her chest. A line of servants passed her in the corridor. Not one of them met her eyes. She followed a maid in silence until she was brought before Mrs. Dalloway, the housekeeper. The woman stood straight-backed, her gray hair neatly arranged, her expression calm but firm. "You are Miss Ashcombe," she said. "Yes, ma'am." Mrs. Dalloway studied her for a brief moment, then nodded once. "You will learn quickly. That is expected here." Rosamond gave a small nod. The housekeeper's voice lowered slightly, not unkind, but serious. "In this house, obedience is survival." Rosamond did not fully understand the weight of those words, not yet, but she felt them settle somewhere deep inside her. She was given a plain brown dress and shown her duties. The morning passed in quiet work, polishing silver, folding linens, carrying trays through long corridors that all looked the same. Every movement was careful, measured. Even the way the servants held their breath when footsteps echoed nearby did not go unnoticed. It happened just before midday. A young maid, no older than Rosamond, carried a tray of tea into the sitting room. Her hands trembled slightly as she approached the Duchess. The room was warm, filled with the faint scent of roses and fresh bread laid out on a small table. Duchess Vivienne Montclair sat by the window, dressed in deep green, her posture flawless, her gaze distant. As the Duchess placed the cup down, her hand slipped. A small drop of tea spilled onto the saucer. It was barely noticeable, but the Duchess saw it. The room froze. The maid stepped back quickly. "Your Grace, "Leave it," the Duchess said quietly. Her voice was calm, too calm. Then she looked up. You are dismissed." The maid blinked, confused. "Your Grace?" "Without pay," the Duchess added, as though discussing something trivial. The tray rattled slightly in the girl's hands. Her lips parted, but no words came out. She bowed quickly and walked out, her steps uneven. No one spoke, not a single person. Rosamond stood at the doorway, her fingers tightening slightly around the cloth she held. That was all it took. Later, in the courtyard, a footman answered a question too quickly, his tone just slightly out of place. The Duchess did not raise her voice. She simply instructed that he be reassigned to outdoor labor. "In the North Field," she said. The wind there was known to cut through even the thickest coats. By evening, Rosamond witnessed something else. An older maid, her hands stiff with age, dropped a tray of empty plates. The sound shattered the quiet like glass. The woman fell to her knees immediately, her voice shaking. "Forgive me, Your Grace, please." The Duchess looked down at her with no change in expression. "You will remain there until you learn care." And so she did, for hours. The stone floor was cold beneath her knees. No one helped her. No one dared. Fear moved through the house like an invisible hand, guiding every step, every breath. Rosamond began to understand. This was not order. This was control. That evening, as the sun dipped low beyond the tall windows, Rosamond passed a narrow corridor near the servants' quarters. There, hidden slightly in the shadows, she saw the young maid from earlier. She sat on a small wooden stool, her shoulders shaking silently. No sound escaped her, no complaint, only quiet tears. Rosamond paused. For a moment she considered walking on, as everyone else did, but something held her there, something that did not sit well with silence. She said nothing. She only watched. And in that quiet moment, something inside her began to change. Not loudly, not at all at once, but enough to notice, enough to matter. Because for the first time since stepping into Montclair House, Rosamond Ashcombe felt it clearly. This was not a house that needed obedience. It was a house that needed someone to say no. The summons came just before noon. A bell rang through the corridors of Montclair House, sharp and commanding, echoing from wall to wall. It was not the gentle call for meals or duties. This sound carried urgency, finality. Servants began to gather at once. Rosamond wiped her hands quickly on her apron and followed the others, her steps steady but her chest tight with quiet unease. No one spoke as they moved. Shoes brushed softly against polished floors, heads lowered, shoulders tense. The grand hall stood open, vast and cold despite the daylight pouring in through the tall windows. At the far end, beneath the high ceiling and the crystal chandelier, stood Duchess Vivian Montclair, still, waiting. Before her, on the marble floor, knelt Mr. Benedict Crowle. Rosamond's breath caught slightly at the sight of him. The old gatekeeper, always composed, always gentle, now looked small. His shoulders were bent, his hands trembling where they rested against his knees. His cap lay discarded beside him. Something had already happened. The room filled quickly, servants forming a silent line along the walls. No one dared step forward. No one dared ask. The Duchess spoke without turning. "A gold bracelet has been taken from my chamber." Her voice was calm, measured, and without doubt. "It was last seen this morning." A pause followed, heavy and deliberate. "And now it is gone." Her gaze lowered slowly to the man before her. "Mr. Crowle," she said. He lifted his head slightly, his eyes filled with confusion and fear. "Your Grace, I do not understand." "You were seen near the corridor leading to my chamber." His lips parted. "Yes, Your Grace, but I only passed through." "And now," she continued, cutting through his words, "something of mine is missing." Silence swallowed the room. Rosamond glanced at the other servants. Their faces remained still, their eyes fixed on the floor. They had seen this before. "I have served this house faithfully for many years," Crowle said, his voice unsteady. "I would never, never take what is not mine." The Duchess stepped forward, her dress brushing softly against the marble. "Loyalty," she said, "is often claimed when one is caught." Crowle shook his head quickly. "No, Your Grace, please, I swear to you." "Enough." The word fell like a door slamming shut. Rosamond felt something tighten in her chest. There would be no hearing, no fairness, only judgment. The Duchess turned slightly, her eyes moving across the line of servants. "Bring me a cane." A footman stepped forward at once, disappearing briefly before returning with a polished wooden cane. He placed it into her hand with care, then stepped back without raising his head. Crowell's breath became uneven. "Your Grace, please, I am innocent." But the Duchess did not respond. She looked down at him as though he were already condemned. Then she lifted her hand. The movement was slow, certain, final. Rosamond's heart pounded. No one moved. No one spoke. And in that moment, she stepped forward. Her hand reached out before her mind could stop it and caught the Duchess's wrist midair. The world seemed to stop. A sharp breath moved through the room, but no one dared make a sound. The Duchess froze. For a second, only a second, everything held still. Then she turned, slowly. Her eyes met Rosamond's, cold, unbelieving. "Your Grace," Rosamond said quietly, her voice steady despite the weight pressing down on her, "please do not strike him." No one had ever spoken to the Duchess that way. Not here, not like this. The Duchess's expression hardened. "You forget yourself," she said softly. Rosamond released her hand at once, but did not step back. "If he has done wrong, then let it be proven. Let the matter be taken to a magistrate. No man should be punished without proof." Her words were simple, clear, dangerous. A murmur stirred faintly at the edges of the room, quickly swallowed again by silence. The Duchess's grip tightened around the cane. "You dare instruct me?" she asked. Rosamond lowered her gaze briefly. "No, Your Grace, only to ask for fairness." That was enough. "Seize her," the Duchess ordered. Two men moved immediately. Rosamond did not resist, but before they could reach her, a voice cut through the tension. "That will not be necessary." All movement stopped. At the entrance of the hall stood Duke Alistair Montclair. He walked forward slowly, his presence quiet yet commanding, his expression unreadable. His gaze passed over the gathered servants, the kneeling gatekeeper, the raised cane, and finally settled on Rosamond. "What is the meaning of this?" he asked. No one answered. The Duchess straightened. "A theft has occurred." "And punishment was already decided?" the Duke replied calmly. A brief silence followed. Rosamond stepped forward again, her pulse racing but her voice firm. "Your Grace," she said, addressing the Duke, "Mr. Crowell is innocent." The words echoed louder than she expected. The Duke's eyes narrowed slightly. "You are certain of this?" "Yes." "And how would you know?" Rosamond turned her head. Her gaze landed on a single figure standing among the servants. "Because the bracelet was placed, not taken." The room shifted. The Duke followed her gaze. It rested on Miss Lydia Fenwick. Fenwick stiffened. "This is absurd." Rosamond did not look away. "Search the linen room, behind the second cabinet. You will find it there." The Duke gestured once. A servant left immediately. The seconds that followed stretched long and thin. Fenwick's composure began to crack. "I have done nothing," she said, her voice tighter now. Footsteps returned. The servant stepped forward, holding something carefully in both hands. The gold bracelet. The room fell into a deeper silence than before. Fenwick's face drained of color. The Duke looked at her. "Explain." She opened her mouth, closed it, then broke. "I was told to do it," she said quickly, her voice shaking. "I was told to place it there." "By whom?" Her eyes flickered. Fear replaced defiance. "This was never about theft," she said weakly. "It was to remind them, to remind all of them, that no one is beyond punishment." The words settled heavily in the room. Rosamond felt it then. This was not a single act. It was a pattern. The Duchess stood still, silent, watching, exposed, but untouched. The Duke's expression darkened, but he said nothing yet, and in that silence the truth stood fully revealed. But the danger was far from over. The house did not return to normal after that day. It became quieter, not peaceful, just quieter, the kind of silence that comes when people are afraid to be heard. Though the truth had been spoken in the grand hall and the bracelet had been found where Rosamond said it would be, nothing truly changed in how the household moved. If anything, the tension settled deeper into the walls, heavier than before. The Duchess carried on as though nothing had happened. She still walked the corridors with calm authority, her presence alone enough to still a room. Orders were given, meals were served, duties continued, but something had changed, not in her control, but in how she used it. The retaliation did not come loudly, it came quietly, carefully. The next morning, one of the younger maids failed to appear at breakfast service. No explanation was given. Her small bed in the servants' quarters had already been cleared, her belongings gone as though she had never been there. Rosamond remembered her face. She had been among those who whispered after the incident in the hall. No one asked where she had gone. By midday, another servant, a kitchen boy, was called forward and accused of negligence. A tray had been set improperly, the Duchess claimed. The boy tried to explain, his voice shaking as he insisted he had followed every instruction. It did not matter. The order was given without hesitation. He was taken outside. Rosamond heard it from the corridor, the sharp crack of punishment cutting through the still air. She stood frozen, her hands gripping the edge of the table she had been polishing, her stomach tightening with each sound. No one moved. No one even looked toward the door. That evening, the food in the servants' hall changed. The bread was harder, the portions smaller, the stew thin and lacking its usual richness. It was not a mistake. It was deliberate, a quiet reminder of what disloyalty would cost. Fear returned stronger than before, pressing into every corner of the house. Rosamond felt it too, but something else had begun to grow inside her, something that did not allow her to shrink back completely. That night, when she returned to her small room, she found a folded piece of paper resting just beneath her door. She picked it up slowly and unfolded it. The words were simple: leave or suffer. Her fingers tightened around the note. The room felt colder than before. A soft knock followed not long after. Rosamond opened the door to find Mrs. Dalloway standing there. The older woman stepped inside and closed the door gently behind her. "You must be careful now," she said quietly. Rosamond held up the note. Mrs. Dalloway glanced at it briefly, then looked away. "You are not the first to receive such a warning." Rosamond's voice dropped. "What happened to the others?" There was a pause. "Some were dismissed without reason," Mrs. Dalloway said. "Others were accused of things they did not do." She hesitated slightly before adding, "Some simply disappeared, and no one spoke of them again." The weight of those words settled heavily in the room. This was not a threat meant to frighten her. It was a pattern that had already destroyed others. In the days that followed, the Duke's presence in the house became more noticeable. He moved quietly, asking questions, reviewing records, speaking in low tones with those who had served long enough to remember what others preferred to forget. Rosamond began to sense that something was being uncovered. One afternoon, as she carried fresh linens past the study, she slowed when she heard his voice. A gatekeeper, years ago, accused without proof. Papers shifted softly, dismissed in disgrace. Rosamond's steps faltered. "The name?" the Duke asked. There was a brief pause before the answer came. "Edmund Ashcombe." The linen slipped slightly in her hands. The name struck her deeply. Her father. The corridor seemed to narrow around her as memories returned. Unfinished stories, unanswered questions, the quiet pain that had followed his fall. The past was no longer distant. It had happened here. That evening the air felt heavy. Rosamond lay awake, unable to rest, her thoughts turning over what she had heard. Then suddenly a shout broke through the silence. "Fire!" She sat up immediately. The smell reached her next, smoke thick and spreading fast. She rushed to the door and opened it to chaos. The corridor was already filling with smoke, servants moving quickly, voices rising in panic. "Get out!" someone shouted. Rosalind stepped forward at once, grabbing the arm of a young maid who stood frozen. "Come," she said, pulling her along. Together they moved through the smoke, past open doors and frightened faces, toward the back exit where the air was clearer. She helped 2 more servants outside before turning back, her heart pounding, and that was when she saw her. Standing at a distance, untouched by the chaos, was the Duchess. Her figure was still, her expression calm, her eyes fixed on the scene before her. She was not alarmed. She was not afraid. She was watching. Her breath slowed. Understanding settled in. This was no accident. This was a message, and it was meant for her. She stood there for a moment longer, the heat of the fire behind her, the cold night air ahead. Fear was still there, but it no longer stood alone. This was no longer about defending another. This had reached deeper. It had reached into her past, and now it was personal.
The message arrived just before dusk. It was slipped beneath Rosamond's door without a sound, like the others before it, but this one felt different the moment she picked it up. The paper was thicker, the handwriting sharper, more deliberate. She unfolded it slowly, her eyes scanning the words once, then again. If you wish your father's name cleared, come alone. No signature, no time, no explanation. She stood still for a long moment, the note held between her fingers. The room felt colder, quieter than usual. Outside, the fading light stretched across the narrow window, casting long shadows along the walls. She knew it was dangerous. There was no doubt in her mind. Nothing about this house had ever been without risk, and this was an invitation that carried intention. Not kindness, not mercy, something else. She could have ignored it. She could have stayed where she was, said nothing, done nothing, and allowed the silence to continue as it always had. But her father's name was written in that silence, and she could not leave it there. By the time the last of the daylight had faded, Rosamond had made her choice. She wrapped her shawl tightly around her shoulders and stepped quietly into the corridor. The house was unusually still. Most of the staff gathered in the lower quarters after the day's work. No one saw her leave. The path beyond the gates stretched into the dim evening, the air cool and damp with the scent of earth and distant rain. She followed it without hesitation, her steps steady despite the quiet tension building within her. The abandoned estate stood some distance away, its outline barely visible against the darkening sky. Once, it must have held the same elegance as Montclair House. Now, it stood empty, its windows dark, its structure worn by time and neglect. Rosamond approached slowly. The door stood slightly open. She pushed it gently and stepped inside. The air was colder within, carrying the faint scent of dust and aged wood. Her footsteps echoed softly against the bare floors as she moved further in, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. "You came." The voice broke the silence without warning. Rosamond turned. Standing at the far end of the room, untouched by the decay around her, was Duchess Vivienne Montclair. She was alone, no attendants, no witnesses, no polished setting to soften her presence. Only truth. Rosamond stepped forward slightly, her posture straight, her gaze steady. "You asked me to come." The Duchess studied her for a moment, her expression unreadable. "You should not have," she said calmly. Rosamond's voice did not waver. "You spoke of my father." A faint pause followed. Then the Duchess moved closer, her steps slow, controlled. "Yes," she said, "Edmund Ashcombe." The name settled heavily between them. Rosamond held her breath, waiting. "He was like the others," the Duchess continued, "faithful, obedient, until he was not." "That is not true," Rosamond said quietly. The Duchess tilted her head slightly. "Truth is rarely what people believe it to be." She walked past Rosamond, her voice steady, almost reflective. "He was accused," she said, "and he did not defend himself properly. He resisted. That was his mistake." Rosamond's hands tightened at her sides. "He was innocent." "Yes," the Duchess replied simply. The word hung in the air. Rosamond blinked slightly, her breath catching. "Yes," the Duchess repeated, turning back to face her. "Yes, he was innocent, as were others." Silence followed. The walls seemed to close in slightly, the weight of the admission pressing against everything. "Then why?" Rosamond asked. The Duchess's expression did not change. "Because fear maintains order. Without it, people forget their place. They become careless, disobedient.
Her gaze sharpened slightly. Fear reminds them. Rosamond felt something shift inside her. Not shock, not confusion, but something deeper. Understanding. Cold and clear. "You ruined him," she said. "I used him," the Duchess corrected. The difference was small, but it was everything. A moment passed. Then the Duchess spoke again, her tone quieter now. "I can restore his name." Rosamond looked at her. "It will be done properly," the Duchess continued, quietly. "His record corrected, his honor returned." There was a pause. "All you must do," she added, "is leave. Say nothing. Allow this matter to end." The offer settled between them. Simple, clean, tempting. Rosamond lowered her gaze briefly, her thoughts moving quickly. For a moment, the image of her father, his name cleared, his dignity restored, stood clearly before her. Then she looked up again. "No." The word came without hesitation. The Duchess's eyes narrowed slightly. "No," she repeated. "I will not trade silence for truth." The room grew still. For the first time, something flickered across the Duchess's face. Not anger, something closer to disbelief. "You believe you have power here?" she asked. Rosamond did not answer. Instead, she took a small step back and waited. A sound followed. Footsteps. Measured. Approaching. The Duchess turned sharply toward the entrance. From the shadows, figures emerged. Duke Alastair Montclair stepped forward, his expression controlled, his gaze fixed directly on his wife. Behind him stood two men, silent and steady. Witnesses. The Duchess's composure faltered, only slightly, but enough. "You arranged this," she said quietly. The Duke did not raise his voice. "I heard enough." The words settled with finality. Everything that had been spoken, every admission, every justification, now stood beyond denial. The Duchess remained still.
For the first time, her control slipped. The balance had shifted, and in that quiet, undeniable moment, her power broke. By morning, Montclair House no longer felt like the same place. Nothing dramatic was announced to the countryside. No carriage of visitors arrived. No public scandal unfolded at the gates. Yet within the walls of the great estate, everything had changed. The shift could be felt in the air itself, in the way doors opened without panic, in the way servants glanced at one another as though waiting to see if the change was real. The Duchess was gone. She had not left with tears, nor with shouting, nor with one final display of power. She was removed quietly but completely. Her rooms were sealed. Her instructions no longer carried weight. Her footsteps no longer echoed through the long corridors. The silence she left behind was unlike the silence she had ruled with. It did not press down on the house. It lifted from it. At first, the staff did not know how to trust what had happened. Years of fear did not disappear in a single night. People still lowered their voices by habit. They still paused when speaking, still looked over their shoulders before finishing a sentence. But truth has its own way of moving through a house. It passed from the kitchens to the laundry rooms, from the back stairs to the servants' hall. The Duchess had been exposed. The Duke had heard everything. Her reign had ended. And slowly, the fear began to loosen. Mr. Benedict Crowle was the first visible sign that the old order had truly fallen. He returned to his post at the gates, not as a man barely tolerated, but as one whose honor had been publicly restored. The deep strain that had settled on his face after the accusation began to fade. He stood straighter. His voice regained its quiet steadiness. When Rosamond passed him that morning, he removed his cap and bowed his head to her with deep feeling in his eyes. "Miss Ashcombe," he said softly, "I shall never forget what you did." Rosamond gave him a small nod, unable to answer at once. There was too much weight in simple kindness now, too much pain behind relief. Later that day, the household was gathered once more in the grand hall. This time, no one knelt on the marble floor. No cane waited in an outstretched hand.
The chandeliers still glowed above them, the windows still poured pale light across the polished surfaces, but the room no longer felt like a court of punishment. Duke Alistair Montclair stood before the staff, his expression grave but clear. One by one, wrongs that had long been ignored were spoken aloud. Apologies were issued publicly to those who had suffered humiliation, false accusations, or cruel treatment. The words were not decorative, they were measured and direct. Past grievances would be reviewed, records would be corrected, those who had been driven out unfairly would be acknowledged where possible, wages withheld without cause would be restored. Rosamond stood among the others, listening in stillness. Around her, some servants kept their eyes lowered, not from fear now, but from emotion too difficult to show openly. An older maid pressed a handkerchief to her mouth. A footman stared ahead as though trying to steady himself. In a house where suffering had once been normal, simple fairness now felt almost overwhelming. Then the Duke's voice carried through the hall once more. "No voice within these walls shall be silenced again." The words settled deeply into the room. No one moved for a moment. It was as though the house itself had heard them. For Rosamond, however, the deepest moment came later in the Duke's study. A document lay on the desk before her, neatly prepared, bearing the official correction of her father's record. The false accusation against Edmund Ashcombe had been removed. His dismissal in disgrace had been overturned. His name, so long buried beneath shame he never deserved, had been restored with dignity. Rosamond stared at the paper quietly, her eyes fixed on the ink as though it might vanish if she blinked. She had imagined justice many times, but never like this. Not loud, not triumphant, not filled with revenge. What she felt was something gentler and heavier at once. A deep ache loosening at last. A wound that had not healed, but had finally been seen. Her father would not return. Nothing could undo what had been done to him. Nothing could give back the years, the suffering, the silence that followed his fall. But his name no longer belonged to disgrace. It belonged to truth. And that mattered. When she left the study, her eyes were wet, though she made no effort to wipe them at once. There was no shame in those tears. They came not from weakness, but from release. In the days that followed, the house continued to change. Meals in the servants' hall became fuller again, warm bread returning to the table alongside thick stew and fresh butter. Conversations, once cut short by caution, began to last a little longer. Windows were opened, curtains were drawn back, even laughter, faint and uncertain at first, returned in small moments. Then came the Duke's offer. He asked Rosamond to remain at Montclair House in a higher position, one that carried trust and responsibility. It was not offered as a reward for bravery, nor as a gesture of pity. It was given because he had seen in her something the house had long been without: conscience. Rosamond accepted, but not for status. She had no hunger for power. She knew too well what power without mercy could become. She accepted because she understood what the house needed now. Not fear, not silence, but steadiness, fairness, someone who would not look away. One evening, as the last light of day softened the long corridors, Rosamond walked through the howls of Montclair House alone. The walls were the same, the carpets, the portraits, the polished banisters, the scent of wax and linen, none of that had changed. And yet everything felt different. The silence that lived there was harsh and watchful. Now it was gentler, touched by rest, by possibility, by the quiet beginning of hope. Rosamond did not think of herself as a hero. She had not stepped forward in search of glory. She had only refused to remain silent when silence would have made her part of the cruelty. And because of that, the house that had once been ruled by fear had learned to breathe again.
If this story moved you, if you felt even a moment of what Rosamond felt, then you're exactly where you're meant to be. Stories like this remind us that even the quietest voice can change everything. So before you go, take a second to tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? I'd really love to know. And if you enjoy powerful stories of courage, truth, and justice like this, make sure you subscribe and turn on your notifications, because the next story
might stay with you even longer.